I spent 37 years as a wildlife biologist in the Pacific Northwest, and in all that time, I told myself that science could explain everything I encountered in those ancient forests. I was wrong. What I discovered during 6 days alone in the Cascade Wilderness in 1998 wasn't just an unknown species, it was a truth so profound, so impossibly ancient, that even now, 26 years later, I can barely speak of it without my hands trembling. My name is Dr. Nathan Cross. I'm 63 years old, and what the creature whispered to me in those woods changed everything I thought I knew about consciousness, evolution, and the very nature of what it means to be human. The September morning I set out on that expedition was unremarkable in every way except one. The air carried that peculiar crystalline quality that comes just before autumn fully settles into the mountains, when the Douglas firs still hold their deep summer green, but the underbrush has begun its slow surrender to gold and amber. I had planned a solo research trip to document elk migration patterns in a remote valley nearly 40 miles from the nearest logging road, a place so isolated that even seasoned rangers rarely ventured there. My backpack held 6 days of freeze-dried meals, water purification tablets, camping gear, recording equipment, and my research notebooks. Everything a methodical scientist needed for routine fieldwork. What I didn't bring was any preparation for what awaited me in that valley. Because how do you prepare for something that shouldn't exist? The hike in took me 2 full days of hard climbing through terrain that grew progressively wilder and more primordial with each mile. Cell service had vanished within the first hour, and by the time I made camp that first night, the silence was so complete it felt almost aggressive, pressing against my eardrums like a physical presence. I'd worked in remote locations my entire career: Alaska's Brooks Range, the Yellowstone backcountry, the cloud forests of Costa Rica, but something about this particular stretch of forest felt different. The trees grew taller here, their trunks so massive that 3 men couldn't encircle them with linked arms. Some of these giants were 500 years old, possibly more, standing witness to centuries of seasons and storms and secrets. The canopy overhead filtered sunlight into shifting columns of amber and green, and the forest floor was carpeted with moss so thick it muffled every footstep into whispered nothingness. Nurse logs the size of small houses lay where they'd fallen decades or even centuries ago, their decomposing bulk nurturing entire ecosystems of ferns, seedlings, and fungi. I told myself the unease crawling up my spine was just fatigue from the climb, nothing more. Scientists don't believe in premonitions. We believe in data, in observable phenomena, in explanations that can be tested and verified. On the 3rd day, I reached the valley I'd been seeking. It was perfect, a bowl of old-growth forest cupped between 3 ridgelines, with a clear stream running through its center and signs of elk activity everywhere I looked. Fresh rubs on tree bark showed where bulls had been marking territory. Trails worn into the earth revealed regular migration routes. Droppings of various ages indicated a healthy, active population moving through this valley on a predictable schedule. I set up my base camp near the stream, positioning my tent on a small rise that offered good visibility and drainage. The routine work of unpacking gear and organizing my equipment calmed the strange nervousness that had been building since I'd entered this region. This was familiar territory, metaphorically speaking. I knew how to be alone in the wilderness. I knew how to observe, document, and analyze. I'd spent decades doing exactly this, and the methodical process of setting up a research camp was as comfortable to me as breathing. That first night in the valley passed without incident, though I slept poorly. My dreams were fragmented and strange, filled with the sensation of being watched by eyes I couldn't see, of hearing voices that spoke in frequencies just below the threshold of human hearing. I woke repeatedly, listening to the darkness outside my tent, hearing nothing but wind and water and the occasional crack of a branch settling in the cold. Each time I woke, I checked my watch. 1:43 in the morning, 3:17, 4:55, marking time until dawn came and I could shake off the irrational anxiety that had plagued my sleep. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was just the altitude and the isolation playing tricks on my nervous system. The human brain, after all, is wired to find patterns even in randomness, to populate empty spaces with imagined threats. It's an evolutionary adaptation that kept our ancestors alive on the African savanna. But in the modern world, in the wilderness that we've mapped and measured and convinced ourselves we've tamed, it mostly just creates false alarms. I spent that first full day in the valley doing what I'd come to do, setting up my research protocols, deploying motion-triggered cameras at strategic points around the valley, marking elk trails on my topographic maps, collecting scat samples for later analysis. The work was absorbing and familiar, and by afternoon I'd almost forgotten the unease of the previous night. Almost. But there were small things that kept pulling at my attention, details that didn't quite fit the pattern I expected. The bird activity was oddly subdued for this time of year. I saw ravens and stellar jays, heard the distant drumming of a pileated woodpecker, but there should have been more. Warblers, thrushes, sparrows, the usual chorus of small forest birds that fill these woods with song. The silence felt deliberate somehow, as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Around 4 in the afternoon, I was examining a section of stream bank where elk had clearly been coming to drink when I noticed something that made me pause. There were tracks in the mud, as I'd expected, but not all of them were elk. Mixed in with the cloven hoof prints were others, canine, probably coyote, and what looked like raccoon, and then something else. Something I almost dismissed as a distorted bear print, except that bears don't step quite like that, and the toe arrangement was wrong. I crouched down, studying the partial print, trying to make it fit into a category I recognized. It was too eroded by water and subsequent animal traffic to be conclusive, but something about it bothered me. I took a photograph, made a quick sketch in my field notebook, and moved on, filing it away as an anomaly to think about later. The sound came on the second night in the valley, and it was like nothing I'd ever heard before. I documented wolf howls in Alaska, recorded mountain lion screams in Colorado, listened to bull elk bugling during the rut in Wyoming. I'd heard bears grunt and moan, coyotes yip and howl, owls call in the darkness. This was none of those things. It started low, almost below the range of hearing, a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself rather than traveling through air. The bass notes of it rattled in my chest cavity, making my heart skip irregularly. Then it rose, modulating through tones that felt almost structured, almost intentional, like language stripped of words but retaining grammar and inflection. There were patterns in it, repetitions with variations, call and response structures with no response, modulations that suggested emotion or emphasis. The vocalization lasted perhaps 15 seconds, but in that time, every other sound in the valley ceased. The stream seemed to quiet, though, of course, water doesn't stop flowing because something vocalized. The wind held its breath. Even my own heartbeat felt suspended, as though my autonomic nervous system had decided that this was a moment requiring absolute stillness, absolute attention. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my scientific training warring with something more primal, something that had been encoded in my DNA long before humans invented science or logic, or the comforting fiction that we were the apex predators who had nothing to fear in the dark. Part of me wanted to grab my recording equipment, to document this extraordinary vocalization, to capture evidence of something unknown. Another part, the part that still remembered what it meant to be prey, the part that knew on some cellular level that there were still things in the dark that were bigger and stronger and more dangerous than soft, slow humans. Wanted to make myself as small and quiet as possible, to disappear into insignificance, to become beneath notice. I compromised by remaining absolutely still, listening with every fiber of my being, trying to locate the source of the sound. It had come from somewhere to the northwest, perhaps half a mile away, up the slope toward the ridgeline. As the seconds stretched into minutes and the normal night sounds gradually resumed, first the stream, then the wind, then a distant owl calling, then the closer rustle of what might have been a mouse or vole moving through the undergrowth, I began cataloging possibilities. A bear, perhaps, though I'd never heard a bear make a sound remotely like that. bears can be remarkably vocal. They huff and grunt and moan, and during mating season, produce sounds that can be startling in their intensity. But this had been different, more complex, more structured. An unknown bird species, though the volume and depth suggested something much larger than any bird. The largest bird in these forests was the pileated woodpecker, and while their calls could be surprisingly loud, this had been something else entirely. Equipment malfunction, creating auditory hallucinations. Though I knew that was rationalization rather than reason. I didn't have any equipment running that could produce sound, and hallucinations don't make the forest go silent. Some acoustic phenomenon, perhaps, a trick of wind and terrain that had distorted and amplified some ordinary sound into something extraordinary. That was the explanation I tried to hold on to, but it felt thin even as I constructed it in my mind. Sleep was impossible after that. I lay in my tent as the hours crawled toward dawn, my mind turning over that sound again and again, trying to fit it into some framework that made sense. I thought about the indigenous stories I'd heard over the years, the Salish tales of the Sasquatch, the wild man of the woods who lived in the high mountains and avoided human contact. I'd always dismissed these stories as folklore, cultural narratives that served social purposes but didn't represent literal reality. Every culture had such stories. Wild men, forest spirits, creatures that dwelled in the liminal spaces between civilization and wilderness. They were metaphors, warnings to children to stay close to camp, explanations for sounds in the night that had mundane causes but fired the imagination. They weren't real. They couldn't be real, because if they were, then everything I'd been taught about North American megafauna, about the fossil record, about the impossibility of a large primate surviving undetected in the modern world, all of that would be wrong. By the time pale light began filtering through the tent fabric, I'd convinced myself that whatever had made that vocalization was simply an aspect of this ecosystem I hadn't encountered before. The Pacific Northwest was still revealing new species to science. Just a few years earlier, researchers had discovered a new species of cloud forest salamander less than 50 miles from here. In the mid-90s, a new species of muntjac deer had been identified in Vietnam, a creature the size of a large dog that had somehow evaded scientific documentation until the end of the 20th century. Why not an unknown large mammal with unusual vocalizations? Perhaps a bear with some genetic anomaly affecting its vocal cords. Perhaps an individual with learned behavior that was atypical for its species. The explanation was thin, and I knew it, but it was better than the alternative that kept whispering at the edges of my consciousness. I spent that third day trying to work, setting up additional motion-triggered cameras around the valley and documenting elk sign, but my attention kept drifting to the northwest slope where I'd localized that sound. Several times, I caught myself staring into the dense undergrowth, searching for movement, for any indication of what inhabited this place alongside the deer and elk and smaller creatures. The forest gave me nothing. It simply waited, patient and ancient, holding its secrets the way it had held them for thousands of years before I arrived and would continue holding them long after I left. Around mid-afternoon, I hiked up the slope in the direction from which the sound had come, telling myself I was just exploring, just getting a fuller sense of the valley's geography. The terrain was steep and the undergrowth thick, forcing me to navigate around impenetrable thickets of vine maple and devil's club. I found game trails and followed them, noting fresh elk droppings and the scratch marks where a bear had climbed a tree, probably pursuing a squirrel or investigating a bee's nest. Then I found the bedding site. It was in a small clearing, perhaps 100 yards up the slope from where I'd estimated the vocalization had originated. The vegetation had been pressed down in a roughly oval shape, approximately 7 feet long and 4 feet wide, much larger than any bear bed I'd ever seen. The depression was several inches deep, indicating significant weight, and the grass and ferns within it were dry, suggesting the site had been used relatively recently, but not the previous night. I photographed it from multiple angles, took measurements, examined the surrounding area for additional evidence. There were no tracks. The ground was too thick with vegetation and duff to hold clear impressions, but I did find something else. On a tree at the edge of the clearing, about 8 feet off the ground, there were marks that looked like scratches, but were too high for a bear standing on its hind legs. The bark had been scraped away in 4 roughly parallel lines, each about 6 inches long, exposing the lighter wood beneath. I stood directly under the marks, reaching up, and even with my arm fully extended, I couldn't reach them. Whatever had made those marks had a reach that exceeded any animal I knew of in this ecosystem. As afternoon bled into evening, I found the tracks that changed everything. They were near the stream, pressed deep into the mud of the bank, in a location I'd walked past twice earlier in the day without noticing them. Perhaps the light had been wrong, or perhaps I simply hadn't been looking. But now, with the sun slanting through the trees at that particular golden hour angle, they were unmistakable. The footprints measured 17 inches long and 7 inches across at the widest point, with 5 distinct toe impressions and a heel strike that indicated bipedal locomotion. The toes showed a clear opposition pattern. The big toe was set slightly apart from the others in a way that suggested grasping ability, something between a human foot and the foot of a great ape. The depth of the impressions suggested something weighing at least 600 pounds, possibly more, and the stride length between prints was nearly 6 feet, indicating legs of extraordinary length. I stood there for a long time, my camera hanging uselessly around my neck, staring at these impossible tracks while my scientific worldview crumbled like sandstone under pressure. I knew what I was looking at. Every researcher in the Pacific Northwest knew the mythology, the folklore, the endless amateur videos and plaster casts that populated cryptozoology websites and late-night cable television shows. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the wild man of the woods that serious scientists dismissed as a cultural construct, a persistent modern legend that combined indigenous traditions with mid-20th century American frontier mythology and a healthy dose of misidentification and hoaxing. The Rorschach test of the wilderness, reflecting back whatever people wanted to see. Proof of the unknown, confirmation that mystery still existed in our mapped and measured world, or evidence of human gullibility and the power of suggestion. Except, these tracks were real. They were fresh, made within the last few hours based on the water seepage at the edges, the way the mud was still soft and yielding. And they were right here, in this valley where I'd been camping alone for 2 days, where I'd been sleeping in a thin nylon tent with nothing between me and whatever made these tracks except my faith in the principle that large animals generally avoid humans. That faith suddenly seemed naive, a comfortable fiction I'd maintained because the alternative was too unsettling to contemplate. The professional part of my brain finally engaged. I photographed the tracks from multiple angles, establishing scale with my field notebook, my boot, a ruler I pulled from my pack. I took measurements with a fabric tape measure, noting not just length and width, but the depth of impression, the angle of the toe marks, the way the heel had sunk deeper than the ball of the foot, suggesting a walking gait rather than running. I made detailed sketches in my field notebook, trying to capture every contour and detail. I prepared plaster. I always carried a small amount for exactly this kind of documentation, but decided against making casts. The light was failing, and something about the idea of crouching by the stream and gathering darkness while that plaster set, my back to the forest, my attention focused on the task rather than my surroundings, made my skin crawl with a visceral dread I couldn't rationalize away. Instead, I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the tree line, suddenly hyper-aware of how exposed I was, how far from any help, how completely alone in this wilderness with something that shouldn't exist, but clearly did. I returned to camp as the sun set, moving quickly, fighting the urge to run, knowing that running would be worse than walking, because running triggers predator responses, turns you from potential threat into definite prey. My hands shook as I started my camp stove to heat water for the freeze-dried meal I had no appetite for. I tried to think rationally, to assess the situation with the calm logic I'd cultivated over decades of scientific training. An unknown species, or at least an undocumented one. A large primate, clearly based on the foot morphology. Bipedal, which was consistent with the great ape's ability to walk upright for short distances, but suggested this was the primary mode of locomotion rather than occasional behavior. Shy, avoiding human contact, which explained why documentation had been so sparse despite reports going back centuries. I was probably in no danger. If the creature had meant me harm, it had already had ample opportunity. The rational part of my brain kept insisting this was fine, this was manageable, this was just another animal sharing this ecosystem with me. The irrational part of my brain, the ancient part that still remembered being prey, wasn't convinced. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in my tent with my back against a tree, a can of bear spray in one hand and my satellite phone in the other, though I had no idea who I would call or what I would say. Hello, emergency services? I'm in the Cascade Wilderness and I found evidence of Bigfoot? They'd assume I was having some kind of breakdown, or that I was one of the true believers who saw evidence of cryptids in every ambiguous shadow. And what could they do anyway? Launch a rescue operation for a scientist who wasn't in any immediate danger, who just happened to be sharing a valley with something that probably wasn't supposed to exist? The creature returned just after midnight. I heard it moving through the forest with a careful deliberation that suggested intelligence rather than animal instinct. This wasn't the random wandering of a foraging bear or the purposeful hunting of a mountain lion. This was methodical, intentional. The thing was conducting its own kind of reconnaissance, gathering its own information about the human who had intruded into its territory. Branches cracked under what must have been enormous weight, not the snap of a twig, but the deep crack of wood several inches thick yielding under pressure. I could hear breathing, deep, measured inhalations and exhalations that sounded disturbingly human-like in their rhythm and depth. The thing circled my camp at a distance of perhaps 50 yards, moving through the darkness with an ease that spoke of perfect familiarity with this terrain, of night vision that rendered the forest as clear to it as daylight would be to me. Then it vocalized again, closer this time, and the sound seemed to bypass my ears entirely and resonate directly in my chest cavity. There was structure to it, patterns that repeated with subtle variations, like someone speaking in a language I'd never heard, but somehow almost understood at some pre-linguistic level. Rises and falls that seemed to convey emphasis. Modulations that felt like questions or perhaps statements. Pauses that suggested the creature was waiting for a response, though what response I could possibly give, I had no idea. I realized with a shock that made my hands shake that this wasn't just sound, it was communication. The creature was trying to tell me something, or perhaps asking something, and I had no way to respond, no shared language, no common framework for exchange. The vocalization went on for nearly a minute, rising and falling through registers that seemed to convey emotion as clearly as words, curiosity, caution, something that might have been loneliness, or perhaps recognition. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed felt different than the silence before. It wasn't just an absence of sound, it was charged with potential, with waiting, with the weight of a question hanging unanswered in the darkness. When silence finally returned, it felt less like an absence of sound and more like a held breath, a mutual waiting. I don't know how long I sat there frozen, listening to my own heartbeat, before I realized that something fundamental had shifted. The creature wasn't hunting me, it wasn't threatening me, it was doing something far more unsettling. It was trying to decide about me, trying to determine what kind of human I was, whether I represented danger or possibility, whether I was like the others who had driven its kind into hiding, or something different, something that might be safe. I understood this without knowing how I understood it, the same way I understood that my next action would determine everything that followed, that this was a threshold moment where the wrong choice would close a door that might never open again. "I hear you," I said aloud, my voice cracking slightly in the darkness, sounding strange and small in the vast silence of the forest. "I don't know what you're saying, but I hear you. I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to understand." The words felt absurd even as I spoke them. A trained scientist addressing something that shouldn't exist, speaking to the forest like a child talking to imaginary friends. but the moment the words left my mouth, I felt a shift in the quality of the silence. The creature was listening. More than that, it was comprehending, processing my tone, if not my words, weighing my intent against whatever criteria it used to judge the humans who had persecuted its kind for millennia. Minutes passed, 5, then 10, then 15. My legs began to cramp from sitting motionless, but I didn't dare move, didn't dare reach for my water bottle, or adjust my position, or do anything that might be interpreted as threat or dismissal. Then I heard it, a single footfall, much closer than before, the soft compression of forest duff under enormous weight. Then another, deliberate and careful. The creature was approaching my camp, and every instinct screamed at me to run, to hide, to do anything except sit there and wait for something massive and unknown to emerge from the darkness. But running would accomplish nothing except confirming that I was prey, that I was afraid, that I was not to be trusted or reasoned with. So I stayed, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, my breath shallow and quick despite my efforts to control it. The footsteps stopped perhaps 20 feet from my tent. Through the thin nylon fabric, backlit by moonlight filtering through the canopy, I saw a silhouette that made my breath catch and my mind struggle to process what my eyes were reporting. It stood easily 9 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the stars visible through gaps in the canopy. The head was sagittal crested, rising to a peak like the skull of a mountain gorilla, but larger, much larger, suggesting massive jaw muscles and a bone structure designed to support them. Arms hung past where the knees would be, suggesting incredible reach and leverage, the proportions of something built for strength rather than speed. And it was simply standing there, as motionless as I was, both of us frozen in this moment of impossible contact between species that should never have met, that had spent millennia in a dance of hiding and seeking, of persecution and survival. I don't know what made me do what I did next. Perhaps it was decades of field research conditioning me to document rather than flee, to observe rather than react. Perhaps it was the bone-deep certainty that this creature could have harmed me at any point in the last 2 days and had chosen not to, had instead circled my camp with what seemed like curiosity rather than aggression. Or perhaps it was something else entirely, some recognition of kinship that transcended species and spoke to something more fundamental, the recognition of consciousness in another being, the acknowledgement that behind those eyes was something not so different from what existed behind my own. Whatever the reason, I slowly, so slowly unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The moonlight was surprisingly bright, painting the clearing in shades of silver and shadow, rendering the world in that strange high-contrast way that makes everything seem both more real and more dreamlike. The creature stood at the edge of the tree line, perhaps 15 feet away, and now that I could see it clearly, the details threatened to overwhelm my ability to process them. It was covered in dark brown hair, longer and shaggier around the shoulders and head, shorter and more dense on the torso and limbs. The hair moved slightly in the night breeze, giving the creature an air of life and warmth that made it undeniably, viscerally real. The face was a devastating hybrid of human and something older, a heavy brow ridge that shadowed deep-set eyes, a broad, flat nose with flared nostrils, lips that were fuller than a gorilla's but less pronounced than a human's, and a jaw that was heavy and prognathous but not as extreme as I'd expected from the crest on the skull. But it was the eyes that truly undid me. They reflected the moonlight with an amber gleam that spoke of a tapetum lucidum, the reflective layer that gives nocturnal animals superior night vision. But the shape of the eyes, the placement, the way they focused on me with clear intent and intelligence was disturbingly human. And the expression in those eyes, that was what made my breath catch and my worldview shatter. There was recognition there, and intelligence, and something that looked heartbreakingly like hope. This was not an animal. This was not a creature operating on instinct and biological programming. This was a person. Different from me in profound ways, yes, but a person nonetheless, with thoughts and intentions and emotions that I could read as clearly as I could read them in another human being. We stood there, perhaps 15 feet apart, two impossibly different beings regarding each other across an evolutionary divide that shouldn't exist. My scientific training had taught me to observe, to document, to maintain objectivity, to be the dispassionate recorder of natural phenomena. But there was nothing objective about this moment. This was contact. This was communion. This was a door opening between worlds that had been separated for so long that one of them had convinced itself the other was mythical, while the other had learned that survival meant becoming myth, becoming less than real in the minds of the species that had inherited the Earth. The creature made a sound, softer this time, almost questioning, and I recognized the pattern from the earlier vocalizations, but with different emphasis, different modulation. Then it did something that changed everything, that transformed this encounter from mere documentation of an unknown species into something far more profound. It raised one massive hand, and I could see now that the hand had 5 fingers with opposable thumbs, that the proportions were different from human hands, but the basic structure was the same, and placed it against its own chest, over where a human heart would be. Then it extended that hand toward me, palm up, in a gesture so recognizably human, so universal in its meaning, that tears suddenly blurred my vision. It was introducing itself. It was saying, in the only language we shared, the language of gesture and intent that preceded words, "This is me. This is what I am. Do you see me? Do you acknowledge me?" "I see you," I whispered, my voice breaking with the weight of what was happening. "My God, I see you." I mimicked the gesture, placing my own hand over my heart, then extending it toward the creature, trying to convey the same message. "This is me. I see you. I acknowledge you. You are real." The being's eyes widened slightly. I recognized surprise, or perhaps something like relief, the expression so human despite the utterly inhuman face. And then it did something I never could have anticipated. It took a step forward, then another, closing the distance between us until it stood less than 5 feet away. The sheer physical presence was overwhelming. This close, I had to tilt my head back to look up at the face that loomed above me, and I felt like a child looking up at an adult, aware of my own smallness, my own fragility. I could smell earth and pine and something else, something musky but not unpleasant, organic and warm. I could hear the creature's breathing, deep and controlled. Each inhalation and exhalation, a demonstration of the massive lung capacity required to oxygenate a body of this size. I could see details I'd missed from a distance. The way the hair grew in patterns, whorls, and directions that suggested grooming, or perhaps just natural growth. The scars that marked the shoulders and arms, old injuries long healed, pale lines against darker skin, testament to a life lived in these unforgiving mountains, to conflicts survived, accidents endured, the accumulated history of decades, or perhaps longer, written on the body. Then, the creature did something that would haunt me for the rest of my life, that would change everything I thought I knew about consciousness and intelligence and the nature of human exceptionalism. It leaned forward, bringing its face close to mine, so close I could feel the warmth of its breath, could see my own reflection in those amber eyes, and it spoke. Not in the deep vocalizations I'd heard before, but in something closer to a whisper, a sound that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and bypass language itself, planting meaning directly into my consciousness in a way I still can't adequately explain. What I heard wasn't words exactly, wasn't sound in the conventional sense, but I understood it with perfect, terrible clarity, the way you understand a dream while you're dreaming it. the way meaning sometimes emerges fully formed without the intermediary of language. "We remember when we were one people," the creature communicated, and the knowledge contained in that simple statement was devastating. "We remember the splitting, the choosing, the paths that diverged. You chose the open plains, the fire, the tools that became weapons, that became the means of dominance. We chose the deep forest, the silence, the strength that needed no weapons because we had no enemies we could not avoid. Both choices were survival. Both were necessary. Both were legitimate responses to the challenges of a changing world. But the cost of your choice was forgetting. You forgot that we were brothers once, cousins at the very least, different branches of the same tree. You forgot that your success meant our hiding, that every advance you made into the wilderness pushed us further into the places where light barely reaches. You forgot that the world was big enough for both of us once, before you decided it wasn't, before you decided that anything different from you was either resource or threat." I staggered backward, my mind reeling under the weight of this revelation. This wasn't possible. This was a cognitive leap that shouldn't exist. Self-awareness, historical consciousness, philosophical understanding, the ability to conceptualize divergent evolutionary paths and their consequences. This was human-level intelligence, or beyond human, or something qualitatively different that couldn't be measured on the same scale. This was theory of mind and temporal reasoning and abstract thought wrapped in a form that evolution had supposedly never produced, that every textbook said couldn't exist, except it had. It was standing right in front of me, and it was telling me a story that rewrote human history, that challenged every assumption about our uniqueness, our special status, our singular intelligence. "How?" I managed to gasp, my voice barely audible. "How is this possible? How do you know our language? How do you understand? How can you?" I couldn't even formulate the question properly. There were too many questions, too many impossibilities piling up faster than I could process them. The creature made a sound that might have been amusement, a soft huffing that I interpreted as laughter, though it could have been anything. "We have watched you for 10,000 years, came the reply. That same direct implantation of meaning that bypassed language and worked on some deeper level. "We learned your languages by listening from the shadows, by watching your fires from the darkness beyond their light, by observing your ceremonies and your conflicts and your daily lives from hiding places you never suspected existed. We watched your villages grow into towns, your towns into cities, your cities into sprawling complexes that consumed the land the way fire consumes forest. We learned that survival meant invisibility, that showing ourselves meant death, that your ancestors hunted us, feared us, drove us into the last wild places with fire and weapons and numbers that we could never match. And we adapted by becoming ghosts, by existing in the spaces between your knowledge and your belief, by cultivating the ability to be seen and not remembered, to leave signs that you would dismiss or explain away, to become so thoroughly hidden that we transformed from reality into legend, from legend into myth, from myth into joke." My legs gave out. I sat down hard on the cold ground, my entire worldview shattering and reforming around this impossible truth. Every assumption about human uniqueness, about our singular intelligence, about our right to inherit the earth and shape it according to our needs, all of it was being challenged by this towering being who spoke of brotherhood and divergence and 10 millennia of hiding. I thought about the fossil record, about the evolutionary tree that showed Homo sapiens as the lone survivor of the genus Homo, the only hominin to make it into the modern era. But what if that was wrong? What if there had been others, not Neanderthals or Denisovans who had been absorbed through interbreeding, but something that had taken a different path, that had developed intelligence through different selection pressures, that had survived by becoming invisible rather than dominant. "Why reveal yourself to me?" I asked, my voice barely audible even in the profound silence of the forest. "Why now, after all this time staying hidden? Why risk everything by showing yourself to a scientist who could tell the world you exist?" The creature settled into a sitting position as well, moving with surprising grace for something so massive, folding those long legs and resting its back against a tree. We sat there in the moonlit clearing, two vastly different beings having a conversation that could not, should not be happening, that violated everything I thought I knew about the natural world. "Because we are dying," it said, and the sorrow in that communication was bottomless, an ocean of grief that threatened to pull me under. "Our numbers dwindle with each generation. The forests shrink and fragment. The safe places disappear under roads and clear cuts and developments. The climate shifts, changing the ecology in ways that disrupt the careful balance we've maintained. And we face a choice: remain hidden until we vanish entirely, becoming extinct without ever being known, or risk contact with those few among you who might understand, who might help, who might remember that we were kin once before the paths diverged." Over the next 3 hours, as the moon tracked across the sky and the world continued spinning in blissful ignorance of this meeting, the creature told me its people's story. Not in words, but in concepts and images that flowed from its mind to mine with a clarity that suggested abilities we humans had long ago lost or never developed, capacities that we had traded away in exchange for language and abstraction and the ability to deceive. I learned that there were perhaps 300 of them left, scattered across the remaining old-growth forests of the Pacific Northwest and the mountain wilderness of British Columbia and Alaska. I learned that they had a culture older than our oldest civilizations, with oral traditions that stretched back to when the great ice sheets still covered the northern continent, to a time when the climate was different and the world was younger, and the humans who crossed the land bridge from Asia were still learning how to survive in this new world. I learned that they had watched those first humans arrive, had initially tried to coexist, had shared hunting grounds and water sources in a tentative peace that lasted for generations. But as human populations grew and spread, as competition for resources intensified, as humans developed better weapons and more sophisticated hunting strategies, that peace had fractured. There had been conflicts, territorial disputes, incidents of violence on both sides. And the creature's people had made a choice: not to fight, because fighting would mean extinction for the smaller population, but to withdraw, to fade into the deep wilderness, to become so elusive that humans would eventually dismiss them as spirits or legends rather than flesh and blood competitors. I learned that they had names for themselves and for the wild places they inhabited, though the names were in a language that consisted as much of gesture and scent and subsonic rumble as it did of sound. I learned that they had something like spirituality or philosophy that centered on the deep interconnection of all living things, on the principle that the forest was not a collection of separate entities, but a single vast organism of which they were merely one component. They understood ecology in a way that our scientists were only beginning to grasp, not through study and analysis, but through lived experience, through generations of observation and integration. I learned that their ability to avoid human detection wasn't just physical stealth, though they were remarkably quiet for creatures of their size, but something else, some capacity to become cognitively invisible, to exist just outside the focus of human attention, to be looked at without being truly seen. They called it the forgetting, and described it as a kind of mental camouflage that caused observers to unconsciously look away, to rationalize what they'd seen as something mundane, to fail to form lasting memories of the encounter. They had evolved this ability over thousands of years of being hunted, and it had saved them, but it had also isolated them beyond any hope of recovery. "We are too few now," the creature told me as the sky began to lighten with approaching dawn, the stars fading and the moon setting behind the western ridge. "Too scattered across too much distance. The genetic mathematics doom us. We understand heredity, understand what happens when populations become too small, when breeding partners are too closely related. We've watched it happen to other species. The wolves you reintroduced to Yellowstone barely survived their bottleneck, and they had help from you, had genetic rescue from imported individuals. We have no such help coming. In 3 generations, perhaps 4 at most, we will be gone. The forests will hold only our memory. And then, not even that, because there will be no one left to remember." The acceptance in that statement was crushing. This being, this ancient consciousness, was calmly acknowledging its people's extinction as though it were already accomplished fact, already written in stone, already inevitable. There was no anger in it, no desperate plea for salvation, just a kind of profound sadness and resignation that made my chest ache. "There must be something," I started, but the creature cut me off with a gesture, one massive hand raised in a motion that clearly meant stop. "This is why I revealed myself to you," it said. "Not for salvation. We've explored every possibility, run every scenario, and they all end the same way. Our time is ending, and we have made peace with that. Extinction is the fate of most species eventually. We've survived longer than most. But we would not vanish leaving no trace, leaving no record, disappearing as though we never existed, never laughed, never loved our children, never watched the same stars you watched and wondered at the same mysteries. I revealed myself so that one human would know, so that when we are gone, someone will remember that we were here, that we were real, that we mattered, that we were people, different from you, but people nonetheless, worthy of acknowledgement, worthy of grief, worthy of being mourned." The request was so simple and so devastating that I started to weep. This ancient being, this remnant of a divergent humanity, was asking only to be remembered, not saved, not studied, not preserved in zoos or research facilities or conservation programs, just remembered, acknowledged, granted the dignity of having existed, of having been real rather than mythical, of having walked this earth and loved and suffered and ultimately failed to survive the changing world. "I'll tell them," I said, though even as I spoke I knew how impossible that would be. "I'll tell the world about you. I'll make them understand that you exist, that you're intelligent, that you deserve." "No," the creature said firmly, and there was something like steel in that communication. "If you tell them now, while we still live, they will come. Not to help. You must understand this. They will come to study, to capture, to analyze. Scientists will want specimens. Governments will want to know if we pose a threat. Hunters will want trophies. Filmmakers will want footage. Our last years will be spent in laboratories or fleeing through forests that no longer exist, pursued by humans with technology we cannot evade. You cannot tell them while we still live. That is the burden I am giving you. The knowledge that must be held in silence until we are gone. Only then can you speak. Only then will the telling honor us rather than doom us to a degrading end." I understood then the full weight of what was being asked of me. I would have to carry this knowledge alone, unable to share it, unable to seek help or consultation or verification. I would have to watch over this secret like a gravekeeper watches over the dead, protecting it from exposure while the thing I protected slowly died, generation by generation, until the last one was gone. It was cruel. It was necessary. It was the only gift I could give. The only way I could honor this trust that was being placed in me by a being who had no reason to trust any human but was choosing to anyway. How will I know? I asked. How will I know when it's safe to speak, when the last of you is gone? The creature reached into the moss beside it and pulled out something it had apparently placed there earlier, anticipating this moment, planning for it. It was a smooth stone, river-worn and palm-sized, with a hole worn through its center by water and time. The stone fit perfectly in my hand, the hole large enough to put a finger through, the surface polished by who knows how many years of tumbling in glacial streams. "When you find one of these at the place we first met," the creature explained, "you will know we are gone. It is our custom, when the last of a family line dies, to leave such a stone where we experienced our greatest joy or our deepest sorrow. It is a marker, a memorial, a way of saying we were here and this place mattered to us. When you return to this valley and find this marker at the spot where we first acknowledged each other, you will know that the one who placed it was the last. Then you may speak. Then you may tell our story without fear of bringing harm." The sun was rising now, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, the color slowly bleeding into the valley, transforming the monochrome moonlit world into something rich and warm. The creature stood, and I stood with it, both of us aware that this moment was ending and would never come again, that we were saying goodbye not just to each other, but to the possibility of what might have been, if circumstances had been different, if history had unfolded along different lines. "I have shown you something we have shown no human in 500 years, the creature said, and I could hear the weight of that in the communication, could sense the enormity of the choice it had made. "I have trusted you with our ending, with the story of our extinction, with the truth of what we were and what we will cease to be. Do not waste this trust. Do not let them turn us into monsters or mysteries or myths when you finally speak. When you tell our story, tell them we were people. Different from you, yes, but people nonetheless. We loved our mates and our children. We grieved when they died. We wondered at the stars and told stories around our own fires in caves you never found. We taught our children to be strong and quiet and invisible. We tried to survive with dignity in a world that had no place left for us. Tell them that. Make them understand what was lost." "I promise," I said, and I meant it with every atom of my being, with a conviction that went beyond words or oaths. "I promise I'll tell them the truth. I promise I'll make them understand what was lost when you disappeared. I promise I'll honor your memory, honor your people, honor what you were." The creature nodded once, a gesture it had learned from watching humans, and then it did something I didn't expect. It reached out and gently touched my face, one enormous hand cupping my cheek with shocking tenderness, the gesture so intimate and so human that it broke something inside me. The touch lasted only a second, but in that second I felt a transmission of something that went beyond language or thought, a sharing of grief and gratitude and farewell that left me gasping, that carved itself into my memory with an intensity that 26 years have not diminished. Then it turned and walked into the forest, moving with that same grace and deliberation I'd observed before, and I watched until I could no longer distinguish its form from the shadows between the trees. Even then, I stood there, holding that stone with the hole worn through it, trying to memorize every detail of what had just occurred, because I knew that memory would have to sustain me through decades of silence, through years of carrying this knowledge alone. I stayed in that valley for 3 more days, but I never saw the creature again. I heard vocalizations in the distance once or twice, sounds that might have been farewell or might have been just the ordinary calls of a being going about its ancient life. I continued my research, documented the elk patterns I'd come to study, took my photographs and measurements and samples, maintained the fiction that this was an ordinary field study. But everything had changed. I saw the forest differently now. understood it as not just habitat for animals, but as sanctuary for consciousness, for intelligence, for peoples who had learned to exist in the margins of human awareness. On the 6th day, I packed up my camp and hiked out, carrying knowledge that weighed more than all my equipment combined. The descent seemed to take less time than the ascent, or perhaps I was just moving faster, eager to return to the mundane world where the greatest mystery was how elk decided their migration routes, where the impossible stayed safely theoretical. The years that followed were the hardest of my life. I continued my career, published papers on elk ecology and forest dynamics, attended conferences where I presented research that seemed trivial compared to what I carried in silence. I advised graduate students, served on committees, did all the things that successful academics do, all while carrying this impossible secret. There were times I nearly broke, nearly told someone just to share the burden, to have one other person know what I knew. But I had made a promise to a dying people, and I would not break it, no matter what it cost me in sleepless nights and the slow erosion of certainty that comes from holding knowledge you cannot verify, cannot share, cannot even speak of without sounding delusional. I returned to that valley every year, always finding reasons to conduct research in that particular area, always checking for the stone that would signal the end. I watched the forests around the valley shrink as logging operations crept closer. I saw the effects of climate change in the shifting tree lines, the changing snowpack, the alterations in timing of seasonal events, and I wondered how much longer those ancient people could survive in an ecosystem that was transforming faster than they could adapt. 15 years passed, then 20. I retired from active research but continued my annual pilgrimages to the valley, turning them into personal expeditions that no longer required institutional approval or scientific justification. The valley itself remained pristine. It had been incorporated into a wilderness area that protected it from development, but the world around it continued to change, continued to shrink the viable habitat for creatures that needed vast territories and deep isolation. Last month, 26 years after that September night when my world changed, I returned to the valley again. It was early autumn, the same season as my first visit. The forest felt different somehow, quieter, emptier, like a cathedral after the congregation has departed and only the echoes remain. I made my way to the clearing where I'd first made contact, that space where the impossible had become real, where I'd looked into amber eyes and seen a mirror of my own consciousness reflected back. There, placed carefully on the moss-covered rock where I'd sat that night 26 years ago, was a river stone with a hole worn through its center. It was identical to the one I'd been given, the one I'd carried with me every day since then, the one that sat in my pocket even now. But this was a different stone, placed here recently. The moss beneath it was still green, not yellowed from being covered. I stood there for a long time, that stone in my hand, weeping for a people I'd met only once but had mourned for 26 years. They were gone. The last of them had fulfilled the custom, placing this marker to tell me that their time had ended. Somewhere in these mountains, perhaps in a hidden place I would never find, the final member of an ancient lineage had died alone, and with that death, a whole branch of humanity, or something so close to humanity that the distinction barely mattered, had been severed from the tree of life. I searched the clearing and the surrounding forest, looking for any other sign, any indication of where that last one had gone or how they had died. I found nothing. They had remained invisible to the end, taking the secret of their final resting place with them, leaving behind only this stone and the knowledge they had entrusted to me. So now I'm speaking. Now I'm breaking my silence and telling the world what I promised to tell, though I know most will dismiss this as delusion or fabrication or the rambling of an old man whose isolation has driven him to fantasy. I don't care about belief anymore. I only care about the promise I made. They were here. They were real. They were people. They had names in a language that combined sound and scent and gesture. They had stories that stretched back 10,000 years. They had love and grief and wonder and philosophy. They raised their children in hidden places and taught them to survive through invisibility. They watched our fires from the darkness and learned our languages and understood our nature better than we understood theirs. And they are gone now, erased from this world as thoroughly as if they had never existed, except for this testimony and the memory of one aging scientist who once sat in the moonlight and was told the greatest secret in human history. The stone I found that day sits on my desk now, beside the one I was given 26 years ago. Together, they serve as a memorial to the unnamed being who trusted me with their truth, and to all their people who lived and died in the shadows of our awareness. Sometimes I hold them and remember that whispered communication, those words that weren't words but were somehow clearer than any language. We remember when we were one people. And I think about what we lost when we forgot that truth. Not just them, these hidden kin who faded into legend and then into extinction, but something essential about ourselves. The knowledge that intelligence and consciousness can take forms we don't recognize, that dominance of the planet doesn't equal the right to destroy everything different from us, that every extinction is a library burning, a voice silenced, a way of being in the world lost forever. They asked only to be remembered. They asked only that someone bear witness to their having existed. So, I am witnessing. I am remembering. And though it comes too late to save them, though this testimony is graveside rather than greeting, I am fulfilling the promise I made in that moonlit clearing to a being who showed me more trust than my species had earned or deserved. We remember when we were one people. That was what they told me. And now I'm telling you, even though I know you'll struggle to believe it, even though I know this changes nothing except perhaps the awareness of what we've lost, they were here. They were real. They were our brothers, our cousins, our kin in ways both literal and profound. They diverged from us, or we from them, sometime deep in the past, and both lineages developed intelligence and consciousness and culture. We chose fire and tools and eventually dominance. They chose the deep forest and the strength that needed no weapons and eventually invisibility. Both choices were valid. Both were successful for millennia. But in the end, our success meant their extinction, not through deliberate genocide, but through the gradual consumption of all the wild places where they could exist. This is their story, entrusted to me across a divide of species and time, held in silence for a quarter century, and now released to fulfill a promise made to the dying. Let it stand as testimony. Let it serve as memorial. Let it remind us that the world was wider and stranger and more beautiful than we allowed ourselves to believe, and that every time we choose certainty over wonder, every time we pave another wild place or clear-cut another old forest or convince ourselves that we are the only intelligence that matters, we lose something irreplaceable. They walked these mountains when they were young. They raised their children in valleys we claimed were empty. They watched our lights spread across their ancestral lands like a flood and learned to live in the shrinking darkness between our awareness and our arrogance. They developed abilities we can barely comprehend, adapted to an existence that required becoming cognitively invisible, survived through a kind of intelligence that didn't need technology because it was so perfectly adapted to its environment. And when their last one died, alone in some hidden place, they left behind only this, a stone and a story, and the fading memory of a whispered truth that I'm sharing now because I have no choice, because I promised, because they deserve to be more than a myth or a legend or a cultural curiosity. They were people. Remember them. That's all they asked. That's all I can give them now. They were people, and they were here, and they are gone, and the world is diminished beyond measure by their absence. We are diminished because we've lost the mirror that might have shown us a different way of being human, a different way of being intelligent, a different way of relating to the living world. I still return to that valley sometimes, though I know I'll never see them again. I go because it's the closest I can come to pilgrimage, to honoring the sacred ground where impossible contact occurred and ancient truth was shared. I go because 2 stones aren't enough memorial for what was lost. And I go because sometimes, in the deep silence of those forests, in the spaces between wind and water, I think I can almost hear it again. That whispered communication that bypassed language and spoke directly to something older and truer than words. We remember when we were one people. We don't remember anymore. We forgot. And in forgetting, we became the only human species left on Earth, sole inheritors of a planet we never learned to share. We convinced ourselves that human intelligence was singular, that consciousness was our unique gift, that we were separate from and superior to the rest of the living world. And maybe that conviction was necessary for us to achieve all that we've achieved. But the cost of that conviction was this: the extinction of our closest kin. The beings who might have taught us that intelligence can take many forms, that success doesn't require dominance, that the world is big enough for more than one kind of people if we choose to make it so. But I remember now. I remember them. And through this testimony, you will remember too, even if only for the duration of this story, even if only as something half believed or wholly doubted. They were here. Say it with me. They were here. And they were real, and they mattered, and they are gone. And we are diminished by their going in ways we'll never fully comprehend. That's the truth they whispered in the moonlight. That's the burden they gave me to carry. That's the story I'm finally free to tell. And God help us all for what we've lost, for what we destroyed through ignorance and expansion, and the arrogant certainty that the world belonged to us alone. They were people, they were here, and we never knew them, never acknowledged them, never made space for them in our understanding of the world. By the time I learned the truth, it was already too late. The extinction was already inevitable. All I could do was bear witness and remember, and now, finally, speak their story into the world that destroyed them. This is my testimony. This is their memorial. This is the truth that has haunted me for 26 years and will haunt me until I die. Make of it what you will. Believe it or don't. But know this: I sat in a moonlit clearing with a being of profound intelligence and profound sadness, and it trusted me with the story of its people's end. That trust is the most precious thing I've ever been given, and this telling is the only way I know to honor it. They were here. They were real. They were people, and they are gone. Remember them.